We have you back on the show, Doug. It's great to have you here.
I guess sometimes it's just a matter of unplugging and plugging it back in again, as they say.
I have no idea what I'm doing with technology, as you know, but I got a very helpful commenter gave me an idea of how to fix my internet, and it worked fine.
Oh,
so
great.
this time we won't have issues, hopefully, with internet. How was your conference, Doug?
The conference. Are you talking about the AAU judging and the seminar I did in Las Vegas?
Exactly, yeah.
That was very good. It was a good 4 hour. We were scheduled for 3 hours, but it turned into a 4 hour because there was a lot of Q&A.
You were judging?
Well, it was the AAU World Championship, and that event was Saturday. The day before, Friday, they were having the powerlifting event over there, and then over here I was doing my seminar.
Oh, fantastic.
Then I stayed over, and then the next day I did the judging of the competition.
Well, I got to tell you, Doug, we had such a great response to your first appearance on the channel. People absolutely loved hearing you speak, as I did. I'm very happy. Sometimes my audience don't find the same interviews as I do interesting, but they did this time. And so I thought it would be great to keep having you on. Shorter episodes, not like maybe what you do on Mark Bell's podcast, so it's not so exhausting for you each time.
Okay, all right.
In the meantime, I wanted to update the audience. So Doug sent me his book, The Physics of Resistance Exercise, which I would have bought on my own on Amazon, but Doug was very kind. I have to say something. So Doug, I've read, a lot of books in my life. I consider myself a reader. You're a fantastic writer. I haven't actually had time to read the book from the front to the end because of my baby. So I've been glimpsing here and there.
Congratulations for that, by the way.
Thank you so much. But so I wanted to comment on some things. So you have a voice as a writer, which is actually like charismatic. It's enjoyable to read you over a time period. You have a breadth of knowledge and you connect interesting different subjects together, which is very nice to read.
I enjoy writing.
Yeah. Second of all, I want to tell the audience the chapters are not like organized according to biceps and triceps and different muscles, but rather principles, which makes each chapter much easier to read in general. You also often have historical anecdotes. You bring your interest in sociology into chapters that people wouldn't expect. So sorry to interrupt you. You were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say the first 17 chapters are principles. I'm sure you like the way I introduced the opposite position loading, where I say, imagine that the Leaning Tower of Pisa is over there and it's falling north. And you're going to save it. On which side of the tower would you stand with this strong enough rope to save that north falling tower? On the south side.
Yeah.
And that's a profound thing in resistance exercise because the resistance always falls mostly opposite the load. And many times people don't put the right muscle in the position of opposite loading.
Yeah, but I wanted to make clear to the audience, though, even though it's a physics developed book and there are excellent citations in each chapter that are easy to access, it's very colloquially written. Nobody will have an issue with this book. I got to tell you, it's probably the best written book related to exercise that I haven't read yet, but I've looked at in terms of the writing style. So I got to really recommend it to the audience. Very fantastic book. I couldn't have expected such amazing writing. I mean, it's really great.
Thank you.
But I wanted to say that first. Second, I wanted to take you on a tour of some questions. Oh, before I do, I was tempted to buy your previous book on Amazon, especially now after I know your writing style. But I came across a book that one of my audience told me about that's a sociology book on bodybuilding called Little Big Men by Klein. Have you ever read it?
No.
Have you heard of it? Okay. So I bought that book recently, but I haven't read it yet. But I think I'm going to have to read this first. So,
are you talking about the $1 Million Muscle book?
No, yeah, exactly.
$1 Million Muscle. Yeah, I co-authored that with a professor of sociology.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I read some of your historical anecdotes here, and it's really interesting. I'd love to get that in more pure form. But anyway, let's start with some questions. So, one question I want to ask you about is recently my friend Derek from More Plates More Dates had a MMA coach on his show named Firas Zahabi, who was the former coach of George St. Pierre, and he's a well-known like MMA coach. Anyway, he was saying something interesting to me. In the podcast, he said that the point of attachment of a muscle is the main constraint for its muscular force that someone can exert from that muscle. Do you have any reason to think that that's true? Like, for example, what he's talking about is the point of tendon attachment, like at the bicep. So if the muscle is longer and attaches lower on the upper arm, it would, I assume, have more strength. Does that make sense?
Are you sure that's what he said?
He may have meant something else, but he's talking about attachment points. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a chapter that you'll see in my book called Mechanical Advantage and Disadvantage.
Yeah.
And what that refers to specifically is the angle from which a muscle tendon pulls on its corresponding bone.
Yeah.
Okay, so for example, in fact, let me get a thing here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, now let's just talk about the bicep for just a second.
Yeah.
The bicep is a flexor, right? Which means it increases the joint angle rather than a tricep, which it decreases the joint angle, right? So, well, maybe I'm using the wrong term. This increases the joint, this decreases it. Yeah. But the point is, this bicep tendon connects to the forearm bone right there. And from when my elbow is bent in 90 degrees, that bicep tendon can pull on that forearm perpendicularly. That's called mechanical advantage. That means that all of the force is being used productively. But as I straighten my arm, that tendon starts to pull on that forearm bone parallel. Right? That's called mechanical disadvantage. Yeah. And that means that I have to pull with a lot more force. So if you want to break somebody's bicep, that's when they do, an arm lock, an arm bar, right? You straighten the guy's arm out. And there's no way he's going to be able to straighten that because he's at a mechanical disadvantage. So the way I explain it in my book, and I'll show you this model here, which sort of further illustrates it, is I say, imagine that I have a lever device that I typically use in seminars. It started off being a seated calf raise machine. I took off the seat, I took off the knee thing. So it's just a lever, a pivot, and a pedestal. And then along the top of this bar, I welded little nuts like this right across the top. And then I take, the first thing I do is I say to the audience, imagine this is your forearm. Imagine that this pivot right here is your elbow. Imagine then that holder over there, that weight holder is your hand. I'm going to take this 10-pound weight. I'm going to put it on your hand. I slide it on the little peg. And I say, now you're holding your forearm parallel to the ground and you're holding a 10-pound weight. How much do you think your bicep is holding? Kind of a trick question. Some people go 10 pounds. I go, nope. And people know it's not 10 pounds, but they don't know what it is. So I said, let's find out. Yeah. So I take a fishing scale and I put it on the very first hook closest to where the wrist would be. Yeah. And because it's already in from the weight, it's already like 12 pounds. Yeah. Right. In other words, muscles don't pull on the weight. They pull on the limb, on the lever that's holding the weight. So as I move down from hook to hook, right, it goes 12, 27, 38, 44. By the time I get to the very last hook, it's 112 pounds.
So are you saying that the closer it attaches on that first limb, the more muscular tension is exerted at that position?
Well, what I say is that all levers function on the same principle, and that is a ratio of the distance between the pivot and where the muscle force is exerted and the distance from where the muscle is exerted to where the weight is. Yeah. So these three components, and sometimes they change position. Sometimes the pivot isn't on that side of the muscle. Sometimes it's in between the muscle force and the weight, right? But these three components are related to each other. So when there's 1 inch of distance between your elbow and the bicep insertion and 12 inches of distance between the bicep insertion in the hand, you have a 12-to-1 ratio. That means that weight is magnified 12-fold just by the length of that forearm. Yeah. And the ratio of the two, of the elbow and all that. Okay, so the reason why this thing weighs so much is because that 10 pounds is being magnified by a factor of about 12. Yeah. Okay, but what I explained at that point is that when I pulled up on this scale, at each point, you'll notice I was pulling straight up, perpendicular to a horizontal lever. Yeah. Mechanical advantage. Yeah. Watch what happens when I pull at an angle. And then I start pulling the scale from a 45-degree angle, which of course is halfway between up and in. Yeah. Right? So then guess what happens? The amount of force required to lift that lever arm off the pedestal is twice. It's 220 pounds. Why? Because I still need 112 to go up. But now only half of my effort has to be the 112. The other half is going in, which of course is going toward the elbow, which is going nowhere. Exactly. So just one thought. So the lower I go, the more parallel I pull to this forearm or this lever, the more force I have to produce in order to lift that same 10 pounds. that before only cost me 112 pounds of effort. Okay, so that's why people tear their biceps on a preacher curl. Is because you have two magnifiers happening at the same time. One magnifier is the fact that that forearm is now perpendicular to gravity, which is the point at which it has the biggest moment arm. It's the greatest magnifier when it's horizontal, if we're talking about free weight gravity. And at the same time, you have maximum mechanical disadvantage, which is your second magnifier.
Yeah. So how does that mechanical disadvantage, how is it related to tendon attachment points?
Well, what typically snaps is the tendon.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. By the way, we mentioned this last time, just to remind the audience.
Yeah.
Arm wrestlers actually often rip their biceps with the other arm, not the one they're using.
Oh, we talked about that.
Yeah. Straightened out, right? So that I've seen that for sure. And also in bodybuilding, Antoine Vaillant did this recently with his bicep and mentioned that he was carrying a fridge, sort of with the arm extended. But the curiosity is,
I'm sorry. Did I show you this last time?
For the knee, we discussed it in relation to.
No. This is the bicep.
Oh.
Pulling perpendicular to the forearm bone.
So it attaches to the forearm.
Oh yeah, it attaches right there.
I didn't even know that.
Now the reason why that's important is because the way musculoskeletal movement occurs is by muscles crossing over a joint, thereby causing that joint to extend or
that
flex
must make sense, yeah.
based on the shortening of that muscle. So when the bicep contracts, it pulls on that forearm bone, but it pulls on it way back here near the elbow. And there's all of this distance over here magnifying the weight. But when you go like this, now you have a maximum lever. See, before you had a neutral lever.
Yeah.
At maximum disadvantage, right? And when the weight gets heaviest here, you enter mechanical advantage here.
So one thing I'm seeing is that the closer that the attachment point is on the forearm, like to the wrist, the further along it is, the more mechanical advantage you have, right?
Well, the thing is,
because
first of all,
once you move it, your forearm shorter.
Well, the first thing that I would say is it's irrelevant because we can't change our attachment.
Yeah, of course not. Yeah, of
right.
Course.
So, but in most cases, it's pretty consistent. In other words, it's pretty consistent because in order for muscle contraction to occur, where that attachment happens is really significant. The closer it is to the elbow, the less effective anything involving the bicep will be, right? Everything will be much harder.
It's less important where I thought there was an attachment here, by the way, where the bicep peak ended or whatever.
No, that's actually where the muscle converges onto the tendon.
And the tendon starts. So it's really the start of the tendon, less significant than if there was variation where the tendon attached here. But you're saying there's probably not much variation because...
Right, but what you say is interesting because if we're examining, for example, the hamstring and we're considering how much participation the hamstring can have in a straight-legged deadlift, now you say, so which of these hip extensor muscles, of which the hamstring is one, has greater leverage, meaning is tied lower onto the femur or higher above the hip joint.
Yeah.
And what you find is that the gluteus has much more leverage for hip extension. So the idea that you're going to work your hamstring by doing something that the gluteus is better at doing.
Yeah, can I ask you about that actually as a side note? I'm just curious. So I don't understand the hamstring much. Is there actually an upper hamstring and a lower hamstring?
No.
Because when bodybuilders develop this kind of round lower hamstring, it's just an effect of the hypertrophy of the whole muscle.
It's just their genetic, they're the shape of their muscle. But there's four hamstring muscles. 3 of the 4 connect to the ischial tuberosity, which is part of the pelvis. It's a little loop.
Oh, 3 of the 4
connect there. 3 of the 4. One originates on the femur itself, but that's a small part of the hamstring. The bigger part of the hamstring attaches to the ischial originates on the ischial tuberosity. I just saw a study by Chris Beardsley where they were showing significant difference in muscle development and hamstring development with exercise that flex the knee versus exercise that extend the hip, which of course
that's what I would have thought. Okay, that's what you think too. Yeah, okay.
And that's why I say, any effort to try to work your hamstring for growth.
Yeah.
By doing any kind of hip extension, deadlift, something like that, even though you feel a stretch, on
but
one
the
end of
glute
it,
must
you
be
don't
big.
you don't get enough muscle shortening to actually cause growth. By the way, the bicep of the arm crosses the shoulder joint and is very similar to the hamstring in the sense that it also participates a little bit in raising the arm forward, but you would never want to build your bicep that way.
Yeah, some bodybuilders claim that you should put your arm up so that you can access some part of the bicep that's at the top when you're doing a curl, like doing
Like a spider curl.
yeah, spider curl, exactly.
Well,
yeah.
that's a whole different thing, and it's completely wrong. I mean, when you raise your arm up like this, you actually shorten the bicep, which means you're bringing the insertion closer to the origin. So you're basically shortening its starting and ending position.
You mentioned
so
in the book that that's a disadvantage because of the tricep, the antagonistic muscle.
Well, both.
Is in a stretch position also, right?
Both. Like if you're doing a curl over your head, you have a lot of extra, too much, excessive bicep shortening, which triggers this thing called active insufficiency, which is the actin filaments slide over each other and basically run out of room. They start colliding.
I was going to ask you about active insufficiency. I didn't really understand.
So that is active. And then in addition to that, then you get the hamstring, the tricep overstretching, which depending on how much flexibility you have, sends a signal to the central nervous system to protect the tricep or to protect the hamstring. If you're trying to do a leg extension and you're too piked in your position, then it'll deactivate the active muscle to protect the passive muscle.
So it would deactivate the bicep to protect the tricep when the tricep stretch?
Right.
By the way, what's passive insufficiency?
That's what it is. Passive insufficiency is this muscle overstretching, causing the central nervous system to send a reduction of innervation to the bicep so that it can't damage the tricep.
Interestingly, some bodybuilders think, I'm not saying that, I'm not criticizing them, but some of them say that they do better with like raised bicep curls with a cable machine. They like to raise their arms up. I would imagine that's stretching the tricep.
What ends up happening, I think you'll discover a lot of times, is someone says, I like to do this. Yeah. And so then if you say, why do you like to do this? They would say, I don't know. It feels like the bicep is contracting better. It feels like the bicep is peaking.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that might be what it feels like, but that isn't actually what's happening because we know you can't change the shape of a muscle. Yeah. So you can't increase the peak just because you shortened it. But what's happening is that these people who say, I like it, have never done a double-blind study, right? They've never said, I did it this way for 6 months, and then I did it that way for 6 months, and this way proved to be better. That's not what they're saying because typically what they're doing is 3 or 4 exercises per workout anyway. Yeah. So any outcome they have, you can't even tell what caused what.
This is actually my background in academic study is on this like decision science and the irrationalities that we have. So like you've heard of confirmation bias and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So maybe just for the audience to know, we can't really easily predict what's going on well in our lives sometimes unless we have feedback or failure, something obvious. When you train in the gym, you don't have an obvious feedback. You just have that feeling. So it's so easy to have a placebo effect or get confused about what's working right. And
here's an example of that is someone said to me, when I do, let's say, the butterfly machine, and I can feel the pectoral muscle contracting and if I squeeze it, will I get a better result? And so I say, well, it feels like it would. Yeah. But we know that a muscle is stronger and develops more during the first half to 2/3 of the range of motion.
That's why you mentioned in the book that you said arguably the beginning of the delt raise may be more important. It's because the first portion of a movement seems to be more important for muscle fatigue.
Well, it's because of the what's called a strength curve of muscles. All muscles have a strength curve, which means they behave like elastic bands. The more elongated they are to a point, the more elongated they are, the more contractile force they have. The shorter they are, the less contractile force they have. So if you're doing a tricep kickback, you're getting all the load in the weakest part of the tricep muscle, and you're getting no load where the muscle is strongest. So that's why you're never going to get as much growth from a tricep kickback as you would from a skull crusher lying on a flat bench.
But a cable tricep kickback, do you recommend those, by the way?
Well, a cable tricep kickback is basically a push down.
Yeah, it's really a push down.
in other words,
but I don't know if there's some unique thing about kickbacks, because when I did kickbacks years ago, this is one of the few times I noticed my triceps grow much. I don't know why it was really. Obviously, you have
let's just say you have a weight that's light enough where you can really contract and hold that contraction, right? And you'll notice it's a lot lighter than it would be if you were doing a skull crusher, right? Because that's the weaker phase of the range of motion for all muscles. So if you happen to like that exercise a lot because it gives you that feeling of gratification, and so you spend a lot of energy doing that exercise because you like it a lot, guess what? You'll end up getting more growth. Yeah,
that's probably what it is.
Because you're more invested in it, right? But if you compare apples with apples, and you also look at, the scientifically proven aspect of muscle strength curves. That's why the wisest approach is to use exercise that have a resistance curve that matches the strength curve of the muscle, so that you get more resistance where the muscle is stronger and less resistance where the muscle is weaker.
Is the tricep the strongest so it would be the strongest at the beginning of the movement?
All of them are.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Now, having said that, this is where it gets complicated. The tricep is an extension muscle. That means that it pulls from a mechanical disadvantage on the forearm all the time, regardless of where it is in the range of motion, right? The bicep, not so. So when you're doing a bicep curl, if you were to put your arm on a tabletop so that your forearm is parallel to the ground, perpendicular to gravity, now you're going to get a double magnifier, which the bicep is not accustomed to. So you have to factor in the mechanical disadvantage as part of what is adding load to the bicep. When you first start, let's say, a standing dumbbell curl, you're already getting a magnifier. Adding a second magnifier by making, like in a preacher curl, making that forearm more close to horizontal could be too much. And then, of course, not only is it too much in the beginning, it doesn't give you enough at the end. That's why when you go a preacher curl, you end up with zero before you've even finished the range of motion.
You have great diagrams in the book about both the kickback and the curls that are very informative.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, you just mentioned something fascinating. You said that when a muscle is more stretched at the beginning of the movement, it has more potential for more contractile potential. So I want to ask you about cable flies. So most people in the gyms use cable flies with two hands, and they don't extend very much when on the reverse. For some reason, I'm not a bodybuilder, but whenever I've done them, I've used one hand. I found the two-handed thing just never to work at all in any kind of fashion. So I've used one hand, but turned away a little bit from the cable handle when I do so. So there's a bit of a stretch. I don't know if what I'm doing is right, so I just want to ask you. There's a bit of a stretch, and I feel like I get more a contraction of the muscle, starting like that and moving it all the way forward. Obviously, there's a bit of delt and core work because I use heavier weights, but what do you think of the idea of turning away from the machine a little bit to get that stretch versus starting over here, like sort of how they usually do?
Well, what you're actually describing by turning away from it, it would be the same thing as if you stayed in the spot where you're standing and brought the pulleys farther behind you.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Right? It doesn't matter. I mean, the pecs don't know
we can't get them. Right.
Yeah. That's what you're actually doing. By turning away from it, you're actually repositioning that direction of resistance so that it's coming more from behind you. Well, as soon as and this is what I explain in my book, is there's two fundamental things that have to be looked at. One is the direction of anatomical motion, and the other is the direction of resistance.
Yeah.
And the direction of resistance matters a lot because it will dictate the resistance curve that exercise will give you. And it will dictate the magnification. It'll dictate the alignment. It'll dictate a whole bunch of things. And that's why it's so important when you're talking about resistance exercise to understand physics principles. If you don't understand principles, if someone says this is a real good exercise and you just believe it, you shouldn't. You should just say why. You should know why. From a physics standpoint, what are the principles? With what principle does it align, or which principles does it violate?
Yeah. Now, in this case, from what I understand, the chest moves the arm inwards. It doesn't do this kind of back kind of thing here. But when I'm stretching, it seems like I'm aligning the muscles movement with the tension, with the opposing force from the cable better than when I'm doing this. The forces come. I don't know why it feels that way. Does it feel that way to you?
Well, we're talking about 3 or 4. I wish I had a blackboard right here.
Yeah,
we're talking about 3 or 4 different factors. Okay, let's just take the simplest thing, which is, let's just say you have your arm out to the side like this,
Yeah.
and the resistance from the cable is coming from right alongside me.
So
Okay,
it would
right
peak
now-
when I'm inside. Yeah.
So the cable and my arm are parallel to each other.
Yeah.
That means that my arm, which is attached to my pectoral,
Yeah.
is neutral, which means my pectoral is neutral.
Yeah.
As I start to bring this thing forward, it starts to enter more of a perpendicular angle to that cable,
Yeah.
and it reaches maximum force when my arm and that cable are perpendicular to each other, as it did when we were talking about free weight gravity. Okay.
Yeah.
Now we have to add the fact that this is a secondary lever to the primary lever, which means the pectoral muscle is not pulling on this bone, it's pulling on this bone, right? So this bone here can either add to or subtract from the length of the primary lever, right? That's why when you do a press, it feels easier than when you do a fly.
Yeah. I was going to ask you if curling the arm is also better to take away
Now-
that second.
Now, when you take that secondary lever and you bend it, now you've reduced the length of this primary lever, the effective length of that primary lever, which means that now you have to use more weight, right? And there's a few other things that are going on. If I let this thing go out a little bit, I'm going to engage my bicep just a little bit.
No.
Neutral.
No.
If I bring it in a little bit, I'm going to activate my tricep just a little bit.
And that
Right?
changes.
If
throughout
I
the
bring
range
it
of
in
motion.
this much, it's really active, right? So this is degrees of perpendicularness that determine percentage of load of the weight in your hand on the muscle that it's corresponding to. So you were describing something like this, which means that if you don't have your forearm,
No, it was like, it would be like that. Yeah.
okay, yeah, I was going to say, if you have it like this, it's going to rotate your arm outward. Okay,
No.
so if you have it like this, and the farther you turn away from that pulley, or the farther back that pulley gets behind you, the more you add resistance to the early part of the range of motion and subtract it from the latter part of the range of motion, which is good. That's why I tell people, if you have that standard traditional cable crossover that are 8 feet apart,
Yeah.
it's too far apart. You need, if you were going to do like a pulley press or something like that, you need to have like maybe 3 feet, 3.5 feet distance between, and then you get in front of them. So now you have more opposition at the beginning and a little less opposition at the end, and that'll match the strength curve of your pecs.
Is the bending of the arm the reason why you recommend sometimes, I saw in the book, the decline dumbbell bench press for chest activation? Is it because when you bend the arm, because I was wondering why you wouldn't do entire isolation movements always. Is that bending of the arm, is it because I know that you don't agree with it. I know you want to use the lightest weights possible. But when you bend the arm, you can use heavier weights, but the angles also change a little bit.
Okay, so here's the way this works. And you use the word isolation exercise, right?
Yeah.
So that leads me to hear that your thinking process is, if I do a fly, it's more of an isolation exercise, and if I do more of a press, it's a compound exercise. Is that right?
Well, I mean to say it's not isolation in the fly because I'm using like the bicep as a stabilizer, but I guess I'm using less other muscles more directly. I'm contracting less other muscles.
So the truth is that the dumbbell flat bench decline press is as much an isolation exercise as a fly would be, because you're really primarily using one joint, and which is the shoulder joint, and one primary muscle, which is the pectoral.
But
now,
every time I extend my arm, right, the tricep, then so at the end of the movement. So,
no. See, this is this is such a
this is very confusing for me.
Yeah. Well, and this is and I have to tell you this is very interesting. This is where people, if they fail to understand what I'm saying, then they think I'm saying something wrong. There's a big difference between you not understanding what I'm saying and me saying something that's wrong. So let's just say,
that happens to me all the time.
let's just say that this is your upper arm right here, and this is your lower arm right here, and you're going to do a one-arm dumbbell row, right? So the upper arm goes straight, and then whatever muscle is raising this arm, which is mostly rear deltoid, maybe some teres major, maybe some latissimus, certainly not middle trapezius because it doesn't even connect to this bone. So that's raising this bone up. And what's happening to your elbow?
Your elbow
it's bending. But is it bending because of the bicep? No. It's going along for the ride. It's just being dragged up. It's just hanging here. right? So some people think, oh, so rowing works the bicep because the elbow bends. No, the bicep isn't bending because you're pulling the forearm perpendicular to a resistance.
Yeah.
It's bending because the upper arm is rising and it's pulling the top of the forearm bone with it, and it's just hanging like a string would hang. Same thing happens during a press. If you're doing a press and that upper arm is going up, this forearm is just balanced over. I mean, obviously it takes a little bit of bicep and tricep to keep the balance, right? But it's not being loaded. It's just going for the ride. It's just being carried by the end of the forearm bone.
Now, when people change their position when they're benching, they may, if they bring their arms inwards, may use more front delt and tricep, right?
Okay, wait a minute.
Is that how this is happening? Maybe because you're right. I think if you extend your arms out, you're right. It's not really a tricep movement.
Okay, but
hold on a second.
Hold on a second. Okay, first of all, we were talking about flat dumbbell press.
Yeah.
And dumbbell press or decline, doesn't matter. If we were talking about dumbbells, dumbbells are completely different than barbell.
Oh, true.
Okay, so what happens is if you've got dumbbells and you keep this forearm vertical with the weight right over the elbow, it's in the neutral position, which means the bicep and the tricep are essentially not involved at all. Very, very, very little just to keep it in this balanced position. But the forearm is being carried up by this bone, which is rising, right? So that's why I say it's not a compound movement. Now, if you have a barbell, now you're talking about a completely different set of mechanics, because with dumbbells, this pectoral muscle is literally pulling this bone toward the midline of the body. But when your hands are attached to a barbell, you can't do that. You're actually pushing outward.
That's my confusion.
So now you have a linear direction of push. And for those of you that maybe haven't seen it, there's a great article on my blog, on my website, in DougBrignoli.com, that's called The Direction of Force in exercise. Now, so what you do is, it's not enough to know that gravity is pulling down on this barbell. If you put oil on this barbell, you would see that your hands slide outward.
Yes, sir.
That is an indicator that you are actually pushing outward against this grip you have on the barbell, and that's causing this thing that's called friction force. Right? And so I'm activating my tricep because I'm actually pushing out, and the fact that my grip isn't letting me push out is essentially causing it to push back.
Yeah. That's exactly how Scott Mendelson taught me how to bench press. It's exactly that, pinning and out. They're using tricep and lats. And
well, what's interesting is a lot of times you'll hear someone who has a background in powerlifting. They'll say, if you're bench pressing, use a narrow grip. If you're overhead pressing, keep it in close. Why? Because the closer it is, the less magnification of the weight you get, and the greater your output.
Yeah.
Right?
Sometimes they'll do the opposite. They do very wide to shorten the range of motion also.
Well, yeah, but but it changes the mechanics drastically. The wider the grip, the more the tricep, the less the pecs. Interesting. Really? Well, yeah. I mean, if you're out here, you keep.
Yeah, you can't exactly.
You can't really pull. I mean, you're actually pushing mostly out.
I've never really thought about the barbell versus dumbbell. I mean, we discussed it briefly last time, but it is very.
And what happens is people say, "Oh, well, I can bench press this much. I should be able to do this much with dumbbells." It's like, no, it's a completely different set of mechanics.
Fascinating.
Completely different biomechanics, and depending on what your goal is. And this is where people get kind of screwed up, is because they don't actually know what their goal is. Oh. In other words, they're not clear. They might think they know. They might say, I want to be big and strong.
You have an excellent section about motivations for compound lifts in your book. Really, I was just looking at it this morning, actually. There's an excellent section on the history of the argument for compound lifts, the psychology behind it. At some point, you try to convince the reader that he does not need to, defend himself for survival to that degree where they need this kind of massive...
here's what I was going to say. Most people say they want to be big. Most guys say they want to be big and strong. Yeah. Okay. So let's just take these two things separately. The big part is muscle size. And a muscle grows when it is maximally challenged. Mm-hmm. So if you're as challenged or more challenged by, let's say, a pair of 80-pound dumbbell presses, right, than you are with a 300-pound bench press, then you're going to get more pectoral growth with the 80-pound dumbbells.
And you're going to have a stronger pec, really.
And you're going to have a stronger pec, right? Because it's going to respond to what it's experiencing. Right. Yeah. It doesn't know how much you're actually lifting. It only senses how much force it has to produce. in order to create that motion you're asking it to do. All right. So then you say, okay, I want to be strong. Well, strong as measured how?
That's an important question.
If I told you you can actually be stronger doing an 80-pound dumbbell press than you can a 300-pound barbell press, you would say, yeah, but the 300 pounds is more. And I would say, well, then you're using sort of an inaccurate way of measuring strength.
Yeah.
Right. You're using a lift, a particular lift. Yeah. Right. And there's nothing wrong with comparing your bench press max with somebody else's bench press max. But that doesn't mean that your pectoral muscle is stronger than the guy who never does bench press and does 80-pound dumbbell flat presses.
Yeah, and what I know from my little experience with programming training, like for arm wrestling, for example, is that when we choose an accessory lift or an assistance exercise, in arm wrestling, for example, we're trying to mimic the actual combat on the table. So the exercise tends to be as useful as it is similar to something you're doing on the table.
Right.
So if you want to be strong in real life, you should try to find exercise that mimic how you would use that strength in real life. The argument that powerlifters tend to say is that the hip hinge is important for all life events. You carry things. So therefore, you're stronger if you squat more, so on. This really can't even be said for the bench press. There's never in life a time that you press forward with two hands.
Well, the truth is that if you are a power lifter and you are, let's say, striving for increasing your squat from, let's say, 525 to 550, if that's your goal, the first thing I would say is, what will you be able to do with a 550 squat that you couldn't do with a 525 squat?
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like having $1 billion and saying, God, I really need a $1.25 billion. It's like, really? Yeah. Will that change anything? Right. So you start chasing something for the sake of itself. Right. And there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not criticizing it, but I am saying is that, your measurement of strength has probably more to do with the comparison of your lift to somebody else's lift as it does to do with the fact that you can actually use and that this is useful to you, this increase of strength. I'd like to show you something if I can. I just made this model, which I'm very, very pleased about because it really graphically shows this issue of muscle load versus weight.
Oh, this is a very nice model.
Okay, so let me see if I can maybe back up here a little bit.
Yeah.
All right, so what I have here is 2 lever arms, both 6 inches long.
Yeah.
Right? And we know that resistance and weight are magnified by both the length of a lever and the angle of the lever relative to the direction of resistance. Okay, so both of these levers are at the same angle, right? And they're both the same distance. So I'm going to take this one weight, I'm going to put it in the basket. Okay, so now you can see that it's not balanced, but if I go like this, they're both 4 ounces. They're both even. Okay. So another way of translating this is to say, this is sort of redundant, but it's to say this weight with a lever that's 6 inches long at that angle equals that weight with a lever that's 6 inches long at that same angle. If I go like this, okay, now I have a different set of angles. That weight with a lever at that angle is equal to that weight with a lever at that angle. Okay, I'm going to put one more weight over here. Okay, I need to maybe make this thing a little bit taller. But the point is, you can see 3 of those weights is about equal to a 30-degree angle versus, actually I can make a shorter basket here. That weight, that's horizontal. What is this? This is the angle of your lower leg during squat. What is this? This is the angle of your lower leg during a sissy squat. In other words, you will get the same amount of quadricep load with 1/3 as much weight if your lower leg gets horizontal as it would during a sissy squat, as compared to doing 3 times more weight with a barbell squat.
Yeah. Now,
so a person could be squatting 3 times more weight than their body weight and think they're loading their quadricep more, when in fact, that's not true, because physics plays a role in how that load affects your quadricep.
Yeah.
So when I tell people that you get 1/3, this is what I say: you get 1/3 the load on your quadricep that you do on a barbell squat than you do on a sissy squat. I've heard so many people misinterpret this. They say, "Are you saying you're only working 1/3 of your quadricep?" No, I'm not saying that.
I know what you mean.
So it's just percentage of load. Okay, so here's very clearly, I'll say it one time here so you can understand it. A muscle is loaded with the percentage of load that is related to the length of its limb times the angle at which it is relative to the direction of resistance. So 100% efficient loading is a limb that's perpendicular to resistance, whether it's cable, whether it's free weight, whatever, because you're not going to be able to change the length of your forearm or the length of your lower leg or anything else. I mean, this is a little bit different because you're adding a secondary lever to it, right? But if you're going to compare a parallel bar dip for triceps versus skull crushers with dumbbells for triceps, okay? You say, okay, the forearm is 12 inches long, 12-to-1 ratio, right? You weigh 180 pounds, let's say, 90 pounds per arm times 12 times the percentage from neutral. Because this would be 100%. Here's 0, here's 100. You're at about 11%. So it's 11% as effective as it would be if that forearm were perpendicular to gravity. So the math is 90 times 12 times 11% equals 119 pounds of load per triceps. Now, you say that seems like a lot, but if you go lie down on a flat bench and you take a pair of 20-pound dumbbells and you let that forearm get horizontal, fully perpendicular to gravity, 100%, 20 pounds times 12 times 100% is 240 pounds of load per tricep. And the total energy cost is only 40 pounds versus 180 pounds. Now, I know that dips are for other things too, quote unquote, and that can all be looked at separately. But if you're doing parallel bar dips or if you're doing a dipping machine, as long as the direction of movement is mostly parallel to your forearm, you're going to get a nominal percentage of load on the tricep.
Yeah, that very much makes sense. And why, just for the audience to just keep in mind, why then using a better mechanically advantaged movement that allows you to use less weight but activate the muscle more is a better idea, is because the sheer force on the joint will eventually degrade your joint. Even if you're in your early 20s now and you're not worried about it, you'll feel what you did now in your 30s. I can guarantee that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, a muscle only recognizes muscle load. It doesn't know what you're lifting.
Yeah, but your joint has to carry that weight.
Right, your spine, your joints, everything else has to carry it. So cumulatively, you end up getting a lot of wear and tear on the skeleton for an amount of muscle load that you could have also gotten with a lot less weight. And by the way, let me also say, for those of you that are already thinking, well, what about bone density? It's like, you're getting plenty of load bearing to get bone density. You don't need to load your spine with 500 pounds to get optimal spine density. Yeah,
the studies that study bone density study very light exercise training. I mean, resistance training. Yeah. They're not people that are powerlifters that actually, I don't even know if bone density of powerlifters have ever been looked at. I don't know if they have greatly better bone density than those who exercise normally.
Logic would dictate that there's a diminishing scale, right? That if you load your spine with a 100-pound barbell, you're going to get X amount of loading. If you load it with 200 pounds, you're not going to get twice as much bone density.
Well, your body must have a limit to what it can do.
Yeah, you might get 20% more. Then you add another 100 pounds. You might get another 10% more. Then you add another 100 pounds. Maybe you get like 3% more.
But you're more likely to damage the structure, which is very concerning. But
the structures in between.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course, the connective tissue. Now, I wanted to bring up something. So, there was some resistance toward the anti-compound movement sort of theme of our last podcast, and the resistance was mostly people saying experience shows us that people develop the best legs with squats and so on. I wanted to offer a hypothesis for why this may be, and I'm sure you've considered it before yourself, but we weren't explicit about it in the last conversation. So, when you cause like from a variety of angles. So it could be, for example, if you work out very hard, you can cause inflammation from the immune system that could be targeted to a certain area, and then growth factors from the body, which there are many, not just IGF-1 and growth hormone, could be sent to that area to deal with neutralize the inflammation and repair the tissue and so on. So there could be a sense that carrying a much higher load on the body's nervous system could cause more inflammation, particularly systemically. So for example, we know about this. I've actually never read a paper on this, but supposedly squats increase growth hormone synthesis. Growth hormone synthesis is also increased after aerobic training. The main driver of growth hormone synthesis from exercise, by the way, there are many drivers like GABAergic signaling does it, many other signaling does it, but it seems to be adrenaline that's the main driver from exercise. So I assume it is from squats too, but there's other ways to do it. It's not just through adrenaline, but through inflammation and so on. So I'm thinking that if there is some value added to these very damaging spinal loading movements, it's probably because of the sheer inflammation that's caused in the body, which probably would not matter for performance enhancing drug users. But maybe it may matter a little bit for the non-performance enhancing drug users who don't have that growth stimulus.
Okay, there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, let me just say that there is an increase of testosterone production and growth hormone when you do heavy, high rep squats. And I say it that way, well, high enough rep to create an energy crisis, to create this adrenaline thing that you're talking about, right? In other words, if I just put a 100-pound barbell on my back and I squat for 20 reps, I'm not going to get a testosterone increase. Why not? Because I didn't do enough of them, or I didn't use enough weight, or a combination of the two. In other words, I didn't create an energy crisis. I didn't create an adrenaline response.
Yeah,
I didn't create a fight or flight, kind of thing that happens when you really, really push that energy limit.
Yeah.
However, here's the thing. If you think that that's going to create a testosterone, or I should say an anabolic effect, the first thing you should say is, in response to what? Am I getting testosterone and growth hormone in response to cortisol, which is you called it inflammation, but you have a catabolic hormone that's being produced in your body because of this adrenaline. And the testosterone and growth hormone are being called to help mitigate this catabolic thing that's happening at the same time, this systemic stress that's happening from this energy crisis, right? So the question is, do you have enough testosterone and growth hormone to outdo the catabolic? Or maybe just neutralize it, which gives you no advantage at all, or maybe doesn't quite even meet.
Yeah, this may be true for naturals. This may be true,
So the point is that the idea that you're going to do squats because you think you're going to get a steroid-like effect ignores the fact that you're getting a catabolic thing happening at the same time. And if you're lucky, you might be able to neutralize that catabolic effect so that you don't actually suffer a loss from it. But the idea that you're going to get a dramatic boost from it is, is a little bit too idealistic. But let me go a little bit farther and say that the person who's doing a lot of weight for squats for, let's say, a set of 8 or 10 reps with, let's say, 405 or something. And is, when they finish they have to lie down. They're so exhausted, right? Which of course, typically is the goal. You may have experienced during that set some degree of spinal damage. Which you may not be aware of for another, and by the way, this is not a one-time thing, right? So people do this once or twice a week after week, month after month, year after year. And so there is a cumulative effect. So the question is, if you are not getting more anabolic response than your catabolic response, and you're creating a possible skeletal damage, now you're not actually getting ahead. But let's go one step further. Your question was, why do these people build big quads? Because very simply, they are loading their quadriceps. I just showed you on that scale.
Well, I'm not even sure they are. I don't assert that they do.
No, they are. They are. And I've never said, and this is where people don't understand. I'm not saying that squats don't load the quads. What I'm saying is that it requires 3 times more weight to get the same amount of quad load that you could get with better mechanics.
Isn't it interesting to observe that powerlifters tend to have small quads?
Well,
So I just wanted to point out, it's not maybe the compound movement so much as maybe the way the bodybuilders are training in terms of overdoing everything.
The truth is that bodybuilders powerlifters don't look like bodybuilders.
Yeah, but in particular, their quads are underdeveloped compared to their glutes, and you know what I mean.
The squat is mostly.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at that article that I wrote about the direction of force that I just mentioned, I explained there, you have much more travel. That femur goes from horizontal to vertical, which gives you much more upward travel than that little tiny bit of change that happens in the angle of the lower leg. So yeah, squat is mostly glute. But the point I'm making is that if you favor squats, if you like squats, if you are emotionally invested in the squat and you do a lot of them, you're going to get growth.
I just wanted to say something in support of what you said. There's an interesting study I came across recently because I've been trying to understand the causes of the secretion of growth hormone throughout the day. So I've been looking at it really exhaustively. And one of the causes, as I said, was adrenaline signaling. Interestingly, the growth hormone secretion in response to aerobic exercise, and I think resistance, but at least aerobic, decreases the more, in particular in this case, females were trained. So the more that they trained a certain kind of exercise regimen, week on week for a few weeks, the less each individual exercise stimulated their growth hormone secretion. And the authors postulated it was because of adaptation, reducing the total metabolic stress to the body of the exercise, like you said. So very much so, it seems to be, that extreme stress causes it. Yeah. And I'm not personally even sure, like what you said, there's obviously so much evidence of that, the negative effect of the inflammation. You're saying cortisol, but there's a lot of hormones maybe involved in it and immune activity and so on. But there's that negative effect and that slight boost that they get. And it's unclear, depending on how you work out, whether you end up with a net positive without mentioning the damage to the spine.
This goes back to the cognitive bias. Right? Yeah, in other words, if you'd like to believe that your investment in your heavy squats over the last 10 years was a good investment, you're going to cling to an argument that suggests that there's an anabolic effect to it.
Yeah,
it supports your behavior, your belief, right? But a critical thinker is someone who would say, okay, maybe there is. How much of an increase of testosterone is there? Is it a significant increase or is it a small increase? And in response to what? And how do things balance out in the end? And what's the peripheral cost?
That's the thing. The peripheral cost is the main issue, in my opinion. I mean, I wish I could go back to high school and never powerlift. I really do regret it. I enjoy it, but there were many things I could enjoy doing in terms of lifting weights. I don't, by the way, have any serious back injuries, but I'm sure, I haven't checked well, to be honest, but I'm sure I have some hemorrhage discs that I don't know about because sometimes I feel some weird things. I have slight knee issues, slight hip issues. All came from that squatting. If I didn't I was squatting, nearly like 450 pounds in high school, something like that. So it was a heavyweight, doing it for a couple of years. Thankfully, the second I felt pain in my back one day, I happened to be walking around and I felt a very weird pain in my spinal column. I completely stopped for a couple of years. Then I did a little bit more, felt some knee issues and stopped. So I've been teetering on the edge of some of that damage, but I regret doing it myself. I just want to say for the younger listeners, you might end up okay. You might not have issues, but a lot of people have issues with their spines.
Let me also say, you just said, I did some powerlifting and I liked powerlifting. Okay. So let's just look at the word like. Okay. So let's just say that you're at home. Yeah. You're by yourself and you're doing heavy squats or you're doing heavy bench press. And let's just say that, fear of not having a spotter isn't an issue. I obviously have lifted heavy at some point and I can relate. I understand the feeling that you get when you move something today that you couldn't have moved, let's say 6 months ago. Right. But part of the thing we like is being in a commercial gym.
No,
with people around us, and it's so subconscious. You're not even aware of it, right? So as soon as if you get underneath that bar and the plates are clanging and the bar's bending a little bit, and you got 6 or 7 people around you, and they pat you on the back. I mean, part of that is the gratification that we like.
Doug, I often ask my friends who have very expensive cars, like if they have a Ferrari or something like that, so if you lived on an island, right, there were no people there.
Right.
Would you be driving this very uncomfortable car? I mean, it's not comfortable. The reason you like it is partially your subculture and
in part.
Yeah, exactly.
So and it's the fact that humans are wired to seek approval, to seek validation, and to be better than rivals. Right. So when we can squat more than our rivals, we have a sense of superiority. We have a sense of, I guess you could call it achievement, but it's a comparative thing. Yeah. And I would submit that's a little bit of a false thing to chase. It's a little bit weird to chase something that relies on other people's approval rather than just saying, I enjoy this process, whether anyone's watching me or not. It feels like it's producing the result I want, and I don't feel like I'm taking unreasonable risks.
The way I describe it is sort of like the more that things you do in life depend on your subculture or culture or the cultural zeitgeist, guys, the more it does, the less your ego is within yourself. So the more you have a definition of your identity that you care about that is very connected to others, the more fragile you are, therefore, the more dependent you are, the more it affects you, like if you lose your job or something like that in life. It's generally not a good way to live, in my opinion. I haven't seen people happy like that.
You know, generally speaking, people like compliments, right? But I always tell people, and I always tell myself, if we cling too much to those compliments, that means we're open to taking in people's opinion of us. You can't just take the good and then not take the bad. And when the bad comes, oftentimes the bad is completely irrational. But if you've already opened the door to the good coming in, even if it's an irrational good, you've opened the door to the bad.
I've never thought about that. That's
so I always say, look, I don't even look at comments most of the time on any of these things because I don't need anyone's approval. I don't. And so many of the criticisms and comments are not well-founded. They're not scientifically or physics-based. They're not even logical. And so I can't let that stuff in. I study, I read, I do these models, I research, and I talk to people that I know are rational and stable.
You certainly do. I mean, this book really, I have to say again, I never said this about anyone's book that's been on my show, but it is a very well-written book. You're clearly a person that is exhaustive and also very creative-minded. Even though, you have citations and so on, you combine things. Anyway, I don't want to compliment you too much. You don't accept the compliment. No, actually, on that topic, honestly, I'm living at the whims of my subscribers. So I haven't adopted this principle yet. So I get so happy if I receive a compliment on a video because I worked hard on it and so on. Right. But when the negative comments come, the subscribers probably know I've become like hypersensitive. So I'll read the first few words of a sentence because there's so many intentionally crafted hurtful comments. So I'll read the first few words, and if I sense that it's something negative, I block it immediately. Sometimes, unfortunately, I'm blocking some good comments unintentionally.
Well,
so I have to take your principles.
This is the problem with social media.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is the problem to some degree in business. Right. So that's why I have my associate, Mo Larrabee, Smart Training 365, and I let him deal with all that stuff. Yeah. I'm the nerd.
Yeah, exactly.
I do much better. I'm working on the next book. I'm working on the next demonstration, the next thing to prove what is more, what is less, and why. And I like being in that world. I don't want to be in the social world. I don't want to be, I don't want to care about, the numbers.
That's what I would do. I would love to do that. I would love to get to a point where I have somebody else that can deal with all the. Can I ask, we'll discuss one last thing because we'll cut it short just to have you on again within the next couple of weeks if we can. I want to ask you one last thing. So there's a section in your book toward the end, I believe, that you have and I'm still going to continue reading. So every time we'll talk, I'll know more about the book. But toward the end, there's a section about rotating exercises. And I wanted to ask you regarding specifically Westside Barbell. I'm sure you're aware of this. They have basically max effort and dynamic effort day for their upper body and lower body every week. The max effort day for their upper or lower body will have a rotating main exercise that they try to rotate a lot, and they rotate variations of it. So it'll be a squat from a certain inch seat, whatever I forgot what they call that, box squat. So from a certain inch box. Next week will be a higher box. Next week, the bar will be slightly different. It'll be on the front or something like that. Do you think there is value to these small changes in exercises, particularly, by the way, with performance-enhancing drug users who probably recover their nervous systems faster anyway? But the Louis Simmons' rationale, originally I read, was that there would be basically some kind of frequency of use injuries that may occur if the same exercise is used continuously. So, and also he said in experience, he noticed that if they change the exercise slightly, they get more PRs more frequently. Does this make sense? I'm not for or against it. I just wanted to know your opinion.
The first thing I'll say is that when you're talking about personal records, you're talking about physiology and you're talking about powerlifting. And in my focus, as you can see, is
of course,
mostly 99% on mechanics, on physics. Okay, that's number one. Number two is I've done some reading, I've done some experimenting, and I can make what would be considered logical speculation. Okay, so the first thing I say in my book, which is this idea that if you're going to think that variety is essential, regardless of how good the exercise actually is, right? Assuming, of course, and this is not a wild assumption, that you don't understand on what basis to even rate an exercise. Right. But once you understand the 16 factors that determine the value of an exercise, how productive it is, how safe it is, etc., how efficient it is, meaning are you getting the most percentage of the load you're using on the target muscle? That's efficiency. Then you realize that you have exercise that rate very highly. Let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, a 10, maybe a 9, right? And other ones that rate relatively low, like 2 or a 3, and some that rate a 5 or a 6. So if you're going to rotate exercise, you're going to rotate away from one that's a 9 or a 10. And you rotate one to one that's a 2 or a 3 or a 4. You can't possibly logically expect to have a better development from that muscle because the muscle is recognizing the fact that it's getting less load, even though you might actually be using more weight because it's less efficient, or it's end phase loaded and not early phase loaded, or it's partial range of motion or something, right? So, and what I explain in my book is if you just compared, if you did a let's say a double blind study and you did it right, you would pick as the one exercise that you didn't change, a 10. And let's say you're going to compare 4 other exercises that aren't a 10. Let's say they're an 8, a 7, a 9, and a 4, right? And you rotate them around, you'll probably get an average of those 4, which will be less than the 10. You're not going to get a better result just because you rotated them.
That's what I would think, yeah.
But, I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
No, please go ahead, yeah.
But what I was going to say is, in terms of Louis Simmons' comment about overuse injury, there is some logic to that, right? Especially if the thing that you're doing has inherent stress to begin with. Right. If you're doing something that doesn't have much stress, the odds of repetitive injury isn't as high because it's not straining the joint, it's not torquing it, it's not doing things that create that stress to begin with. And most of the all the exercises that rate a 10 on the scale using these 16 factors don't have that wear that you would consider if you're trying to. Now, if you're trying to increase strength, there might be some, again, this is not my field of expertise, but logically it seems that there would be some potential increase of strength if you're stressing different parts of the range of motion or different parts.
I was just
okay, that makes some sense to me. It doesn't mean you're going to get more muscle growth.
I thought of 2 ways it could be for the strength reasons. One is maybe the change in the exercise is causing another muscle in the chain to be more activated. So you're basically giving yourself a break every week. So you're training each muscle maybe a little bit less intensely. And also maybe the change in movement pattern surprises the nervous system, therefore activating it further than it would be, because the nervous system becomes very efficient at a certain kind of movement over time. So maybe they're trying to change that. That may make sense.
I would also think that there's another factor, and I think I'm not totally familiar with the system you just described, but it sounds there's kind of heavy days and light days, or heavy weeks and lighter weeks.
It's heavy, yeah.
And I would say there is a value in changing your rep percentage of maximum effort scheme.
Oh yeah, I want to ask you about that next time though.
I do think there would be some muscle gain that could be attributed to, let's say, for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, you do low reps, high weight. And then for the next period of time, you do lighter weight, higher reps. That kind of variation, not changing the exercises, by the way, just changing the rep, the number of reps and the amount of weight, the percentage of maximum effort you're using, that kind of thing could create a nice stimulatory effect to muscle growth. And then, of course, taking a week off now and then also just gives you a boost.
I want to ask you about this and about volume. And to be honest with you, I only asked you 3 of about 15 questions I had prepared for today. So I think we can continue if you have time in a couple of weeks.
Sure.
Also, that way listeners get to see you more often, which I think is a good thing.
Great. Wonderful.
So I'm going to link your website on the video. Doug, thank you. It's such a pleasure again to talk to you.
It's my pleasure.
Hopefully we'll talk again in a couple of weeks and catch up. And I'll be further along in your book by then with the baby's interruptions. Anyway, thank you so much, Doug. Talk soon.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.